Okay, so I found this interestingly nice page, and we are still reading from the book Saving Time Discovering a Life Beyond the Clock by Ginny Odell. And we are on page 258. So she's talking about death and how a lot of people just feel about, you know, the disappearing of life. And so, one thing she said is when we think of loved ones who are no longer with us, we surely wish we had embraced them more. And then, older people looking back on their lives, they may say, "Oh, I wish I enjoyed life more." But this is what I thought was interesting. I feel alive if I'm not alone in the air, but embraced by it. I feel alive when someone's eyes light up and mine do too. I feel alive if I can look at a deer and see it looking back at me. If when geese speak, it sounds like a language. If when I walk on the ground, I feel it pushing back against me. I'm alive to the extent that I can be moved. So, like Miller's definition of aliveness as touching the planet, Handike's description of touching and being touched, or Hart Murosa's resonance in the epigraph for this chapter, my definition of being alive is simply that, the embrace. But again, what is the embrace? She says for that embrace to happen, there has to be more of less of me. More of less of me. The forward leaning ego that grasps at time has to die, at least for that moment. This death can feel like a trust fall into time and mortality itself. So, the philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti writes that in a state of complete attention, the thinker, the center, the me comes to an end. This supposed emptiness makes way for so much more, as it is only a mind that looks at a tree or the stars or the sparkling waters of a river with complete self-abandonment that knows what beauty is, and when we are actually seeing, we are in a state of love. That state, he says, has no yesterday and no tomorrow. This is easier said than done, of course, and my whole life so far seems to consist of forgetting and remembering this wisdom. But when I do remember, I forgive myself for forgetting. I've come to see this truly alive, ego dissolving state less as a goal to arrive at and closer to something like rain. It comes and goes. When it comes, you make use of it and you give thanks. So, this one to me is about how when you really want to feel in a moment, you have to forget about yourself. And she translates that as like a death of self because it is. You're so absorbed in the moment. You're so much looking at how happy this thing is, how much it's raining on your skin, your toes in the ground, and what is the energy pushing up against you from the ground. Listening to that song and being absorbed into it. But there's a lot of ways to just exist in the world and just be, to the point that, again, like you're not thinking in the now. You're thinking about just, well, wait, you are thinking in the now. Anyway, you get my point. You're not thinking outside of the now. I guess that's what I meant to say. So now I'm going to go into the stones shall cry out, consciousness, rocks, and Indians. The Osage scholar George Tinker makes the case that rocks can talk. This is page 144. Tinker finds it both paradoxical and arrogant, learning how to hear rocks talk, a Copernican shift away from anthropocentrism. Tinker describes attending a conference where a Kanaka Maoli artist was answering a question about how he found the boulders he sculpted. Quote, "I don't find them, they find me," the artist had said. Quote, "I might be walking along the beach and one would reach out and bite the heel of my foot." Tinker reports that a British professor of American Studies immediately retorted, quote, "That's what is wrong with you people. You are so anthropocentric. You think that everything in the world works the way you do," unquote. Tinker reflects on this critique, which he finds emotional rather than rational. Quote, It was rooted in a week's worth of frustrated attempts to communicate across cultural barriers, as well as in a lifetime of immersion in a culture that thinks of itself as somehow universal and normative, thus inherently superior, a position of intellectual fascism, however naive. As he finished with his short tirade, I rose to argue exactly the opposite is actually the case. I'm sorry, Professor W., but that comment cannot go unchallenged. You see, you are the ones who are actually anthropocentric. You believe everything in the world works differently from yourselves. In other words, a view like Professor W's sees nature as fundamentally different from man because it behaves deterministically. If time is involved here, it is not so much inscribed through a series of actions as a force driving materials as though they were inert. Tinker writes that Euro-Westerners have come to divide the world into a clear hierarchy of the divine, the human, and nature from greatest to least, in that order. In a development I return in the next chapter, this divide was historically associated with the creation of race as a concept, where, Europeans encountered in their expeditions were enslaved and reimagined. Not only were indigenous people seen as outside history, but they were interpreted as other communities, lazy, lacking an interest in understanding of the future. One word that comes up frequently in the treatise on rocks is respect. For example, discussing the reductionist view of the mind as the physical processes of the brain, he complains of the presumption that a highly developed neocortical brain is somehow the ultimate achievement in terms of consciousness. So basically, one example of this reductionism can be seen in the everyday phenomenon in which our memories seem to live, quote unquote, in physical objects, locations, and landscapes. So, we'll think that memory is only living in the brain, but really we have it living in physical objects and landscapes. Similar to our use of writing and other memory aids, it is sometimes the case that you can't remember something, details about a certain area of your life, for example, until you are in a certain place. For example, how indigenous cultures have made use of this relationship, explicitly associating stories and memories with enduring features of the physical environment. See Keith H. Basso, Basso. Wisdom sits in places, landscape and language among the Western Apache. So we'll think, oh, we need a brain to remember things, but we know we look to the world around us to remember stuff, and there is a consciousness there reminding us of things, communicating with us. In contrast, Tinker observes, so in other cultures they have a deep respect. Indian people have a deep respect and appreciation for the intelligence and consciousness of lizards, unquote. Likewise, when J. Drew Lanham tells Krista Tippett on an episode of Being that he worships, quote, every bird he sees, it is clear this, quote, worship could not be more different from the estate owner's exquisite love, quote, of mosses. The difference between, the mosses thing, there was an estate owner who just, tried to grab up a lot of moss and, trap it in his house. Yeah, that didn't work. And the moss started dying and he couldn't figure out why, and it's because you took them away from their natural home. So again, the difference between respecting something and not respecting it is the acknowledgement that something is not an automaton, that is registering time by acting and not just existing in it. So again, she's connecting this back to time. And then she also describes Adam White's Juliana Schroeder and Nicholas employ the lesser minds problem, which is this cognitive bias that leads us to underestimate or overlook the emotional realities of others we perceive unlike ourselves, putting some people in groups and out groups are more automaton than human, which we've seen before. So I enjoyed this, and let's go to part 3.